Welcome to this channel, where we dive deep into the pivotal moments of history that shaped the world we live in today. In this episode, we'll explore one of the most iconic and transformative battles in medieval history, the Battle of Agincourt. A battle that marked the peak of English military triumph, but also set the stage for a new era of warfare, leadership, and national identity. Imagine an English army, exhausted and outnumbered, facing a French force twice its size. Yet, against all odds, they secured a stunning victory. But this battle was more than just a military engagement. It changed the way wars were fought, influenced monarchies, and reshaped the future of both England and France. The legacy of Agincourt echoes through the centuries, influencing everything from military tactics to national pride. So, sit back and get ready to learn how a single battle turned the tide of the 100 Years' War and forever altered the course of history. If you've ever wondered about the power of leadership, the evolution of warfare, or the resilience of nations, then this story is for you. Let's dive in. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25th, 1415, is one of the most iconic battles in the history of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that spanned from 1337 to 1453. The war was primarily a struggle between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France, each vying for control of territories in France. The roots of the war trace back to the disputed succession to the French throne after the death of the French king, Charles IV, in 1328. Edward III of England claimed the throne through his mother, Isabella of France, but the French throne was passed to Philip VI, thereby creating a rift that led to the outbreak of hostilities. By the time the battle occurred, the war had entered a critical phase. The English, under King Henry V, had been making significant advances in France, capturing key territories and exerting pressure on the French monarchy. Henry's ambitions for greater English influence in France were clear, and he sought to use both military force and diplomacy to secure his position. The English longbow, a weapon that would play a decisive role in the battle, had already proven its effectiveness in earlier engagements. Meanwhile, the French, with their heavily armored knights and cavalry, believed they could win a decisive battle and crush the English forces. However, this battle would turn out to be a remarkable demonstration of how battlefield tactics and weaponry could determine the outcome of a war. In 1415, King Henry V launched a military campaign into France. The English king had inherited the throne in 1413 and immediately focused on consolidating power both at home and abroad. His claim to the French throne, through his ancestry, made him a direct rival to Charles VI, the French king. Henry V's military strategy was aggressive and bold. He landed in France with a well-equipped army, intending to secure key towns and cities as part of his campaign to assert English dominance in France. The English forces faced significant logistical challenges as they advanced deeper into French territory. The French, meanwhile, were fragmented due to internal divisions and the ongoing political instability caused by the conflict between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. This internal strife weakened the French response to Henry's invasion and left them vulnerable to English aggression. Henry's campaign was initially successful as he captured Harfleur in early September of 1415. However, the victory came at a heavy cost. The English army was significantly weakened by disease, particularly dysentery, which ravaged their ranks. Despite the difficulties, Henry V pressed on. His goal was to link up with the English forces in Normandy and continue his advance. However, the French had mobilized their forces and were determined to confront the English on the battlefield. By late October, the two sides were on a collision course. The French army, commanded by Constable Charles d'Albret, was a formidable force, composed largely of knights and heavily armored cavalry. The French believed that their superior numbers and the traditional tactics of mounted knights would give them the advantage. However, their overconfidence would prove to be their undoing. The French military strategy was heavily reliant on cavalry charges, which had been the dominant form of warfare in Europe for centuries. The French were also burdened by internal divisions. King Charles VI of France had suffered from mental illness for years, leaving much of the decision-making to his advisors, including the constable. These divisions created a lack of unity and cohesion within the French command structure. The French leadership failed to adapt to the changing nature of warfare, particularly the rise of infantry-based tactics, and underestimated the impact of the English longbow. Moreover, the French were not in a position of great strategic strength. While they could field a larger army, they were spread thin across France, and their supply lines were not as secure as those of the English. The French army had to march from northern France to meet Henry V's forces, and by the time they arrived, they were exhausted, disorganized, and poorly prepared for battle. This would prove to be a significant disadvantage when they faced the English on the plains near Agincourt. King Henry V's army, though smaller in number, was well prepared and disciplined. The English had learned valuable lessons from previous battles and had adapted their tactics accordingly. The longbowmen, in particular, were key to Henry's strategy. The English longbow was a powerful weapon capable of shooting arrows with tremendous speed and force. Skilled longbowmen could fire up to 12 arrows per minute, and their arrows could penetrate the armor of even the heaviest knights. Henry V's army was also composed of experienced soldiers, many of whom had fought in previous campaigns. The English were well trained in the use of their weapons and in the art of battle formation. Henry's leadership was another critical factor in the English preparation. He was a charismatic and capable commander, and his soldiers were loyal and eager to fight for him. The English were also able to capitalize on the mistakes of their French counterparts. While the French had amassed a large force, they lacked the organization and discipline to match the efficiency of the English army. Moreover, the English were able to secure better positioning on the battlefield, taking advantage of the terrain to maximize their strengths. They knew that the terrain would favor their longbowmen and limit the effectiveness of the French cavalry. After capturing Harfleur, Henry V's forces began their march toward Calais, their intended destination. The English army, however, was severely weakened by sickness. Dysentery had spread throughout the ranks, and soldiers were dying at a rapid rate. Despite this, Henry V remained determined to reach Calais and make his way back to England, as it was his primary safe harbor. As they began their march on October 19th, they were pursued by a much larger French army, which had been mobilized to stop the English advance. The French were determined to crush Henry V's forces and end the English threat once and for all. As the English army moved through northern France, the French began to close in on them. They believed that their large, heavily armored cavalry would easily outmaneuver the English and force them into a decisive battle. However, the terrain worked against the French, and their large numbers posed logistical challenges, slowing their advance. On October 24th, the English forces were forced to make camp near a small village called Agincourt, not far from the French city of Amiens. The area was a narrow, muddy field, bordered by woods on either side. It was here, in this seemingly insignificant location, that one of the most famous battles in history would unfold. Henry V's men were exhausted, sick, and demoralized, but they had no choice but to face the larger French army in the coming days. The French army, led by Constable Charles d'Albret, vastly outnumbered the English. Estimates of the size of the French force vary, but most historians agree that it numbered between 15,000 and 30,000 men, with a large proportion of knights and heavily armored cavalry. In contrast, the English army was much smaller, with around 6,000 to 9,000 men. including a significant portion of longbowmen. The French were confident that their superior numbers would guarantee them victory, and they believed their cavalry would be decisive in crushing the English forces. However, the French made several crucial tactical mistakes that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The first was their decision to engage in battle without fully assessing the battlefield and the strengths of their opponents. The French were accustomed to fighting battles where they could rely on their knights to charge at the enemy and break their lines. But this battle would be different. The terrain, which was muddy and narrow, severely limited the effectiveness of the French cavalry. The heavy armor of the knights became a disadvantage as they struggled to maneuver through the muck, and their charge would be slow and ineffective. Furthermore, the French leadership was disjointed. Although the French had many experienced commanders, they failed to coordinate their attack effectively. Constable d'Albret and his subordinates disagreed on how to proceed, and this lack of unity within the French command would prove costly. The French army had also been marching for days and was fatigued, adding to the disorganization and lack of discipline. The French forces, accustomed to cavalry-led victories, did not anticipate the devastating impact of the English longbowmen. Despite being heavily outnumbered and facing a formidable opponent, King Henry V knew that his army's best chance for survival lay in adopting a defensive position that would maximize the effectiveness of his longbowmen. The English took up their position in the narrow field near Agincourt, with dense woods on both sides. This forced the French cavalry into a bottleneck, limiting their ability to charge effectively. The ground was also soggy from recent rains, making it difficult for the heavily armored French knights to gain speed or momentum. The English army arranged themselves in a formation that included a dense line of longbowmen positioned along the flanks. These longbowmen were trained to fire their arrows rapidly and accurately, capable of shooting through the armor of the French knights. Henry V's tactics relied on this combination of skilled archers and a disciplined infantry. The archers would play a pivotal role in decimating the French cavalry and creating chaos within the French ranks. In addition to the longbowmen, the English army had a small contingent of men-at-arms and knights, but they were greatly outnumbered by the French. Henry knew that his army would need to hold firm in the face of French charges and that the longbowmen would need to be protected. The English soldiers had fought in numerous campaigns, and their experience and discipline would give them an edge against the larger, less cohesive French force. As the two armies faced each other across the field, Henry V gave his men a stirring speech, inspiring them to fight for their king, their country, and their honor. He emphasized that victory was possible, even against overwhelming odds. The English soldiers, battle-hardened and loyal, were ready to defend their position and fight to the death if necessary. As dawn broke on October 25th, 1415, the two armies stood facing each other across the narrow battlefield at Agincourt. The air was damp with fog, and the ground was muddy, which would prove to be a significant factor in the battle's outcome. The French were eager to engage, confident that their numbers and cavalry would overwhelm the English forces. However, they were unaware of the deadly precision of the English longbowmen, who were positioned in strategic locations to maximize their effectiveness. The first phase of the battle involved a series of skirmishes between the two armies as both sides jockeyed for position. The French attempted to deploy their cavalry, but the muddy ground and narrow battlefield hindered their movements. The French knights, encumbered by their heavy armor, found it difficult to charge or maneuver effectively. The English, meanwhile, stood firm, with their longbowmen unleashing a constant barrage of arrows. The longbowmen's arrows rained down on the French ranks, piercing through armor and causing chaos among the cavalry. The French knights, unaccustomed to being attacked by infantry with such deadly precision, began to hesitate. The dense formation of the French army made them easy targets for the English archers, who were able to pick off knights and men-at-arms from a distance. Despite their numerical advantage, the French were struggling to break the English lines. The first signs of trouble for the French came when the cavalry, unable to gain traction on the muddy field, became bogged down. The knights found themselves stuck in the muck, unable to advance or retreat, and many were struck down by the English longbows. The French had anticipated a cavalry-led victory, but the archers were proving to be a formidable obstacle. As the battle progressed, the French cavalry, which had once been the pride of the French military, faced insurmountable challenges. The muddy terrain, which had already slowed their advance, became an even greater obstacle. Many French knights found themselves stuck in the thick, waterlogged mud. These heavily armored soldiers, whose horses were similarly burdened, were unable to maneuver effectively. The dense formation of knights exacerbated the problem, making it difficult for any individual knight to break free and reposition themselves. Despite their initial numerical superiority, the French cavalry's inability to engage the English longbowmen had a devastating effect. The knights' heavy armor made them vulnerable to the relentless barrage of arrows from the English archers, who were positioned along the flanks of the battlefield. Each volley of arrows rained down on the French ranks, picking off knights and men-at-arms at an alarming rate. The French knights, who had long relied on the superiority of their cavalry, were unable to adapt to the new reality of warfare. The longbowmen had created a deadly perimeter that the French cavalry simply couldn't breach. What should have been a decisive cavalry charge became a slaughter, as the knights were easy targets for the English archers, whose arrows could pierce even the toughest armor. While the knights struggled in the mud, the French infantry, many of whom were untrained peasants and soldiers, were caught in the chaos. The French forces began to falter under the pressure of the English longbowmen. The initial French confidence began to waver as their cavalry, which was supposed to be the backbone of their offensive, was neutralized by the English archers and the terrain. This shift in momentum was crucial. The French were no longer the aggressors. They had become disorganized and were fighting for survival. The true turning point of the Battle of Agincourt came with the effectiveness of the English longbowmen. These archers, who were positioned along the flanks and behind defensive stakes, unleashed a constant barrage of arrows onto the French forces. The English longbow had become a feared weapon of war, capable of penetrating the armor of knights and men-at-arms from great distances. The longbowmen fired their arrows with incredible speed and precision. The French knights, weighed down by their armor and struggling to move in the mud, were easy targets. The arrows pierced through the gaps in their armor, targeting weak spots such as the joints in their armor and the faceplates of their helmets. The result was devastating. Many French knights and soldiers fell within the first hour of the battle, and their ranks began to thin rapidly. In addition to the arrows, the English longbowmen also used their position to their advantage. They were positioned on higher ground and behind protective barriers, which made it difficult for the French to close the gap and engage them directly. The constant fire from the longbowmen created confusion and panic in the French ranks. The knights, who had been trained for traditional cavalry engagements, were unable to deal with the incessant rain of arrows, which shattered their confidence. The speed and accuracy of the English longbowmen's fire were unparalleled. Skilled archers could shoot as many as 12 arrows per minute, and the effectiveness of these arrows, particularly when used against heavily armored targets, was a game changer. As the French knights were systematically cut down, the morale of the French forces continued to deteriorate. The longbowmen's relentless attack not only decimated the French cavalry, but also created a psychological advantage for the English. The once proud French knights, who had anticipated a quick victory, were now in retreat. As the battle wore on, the French began to realize that their traditional methods of warfare were no match for the new tactics employed by the English. The French were losing more men by the minute, and their strategy was falling apart. As the battle unfolded, the French infantry, comprised mostly of peasants, foot soldiers, and men-at-arms, attempted to break through the English lines. However, the French foot soldiers found themselves in a perilous position. They had no cavalry support to rely on, and they were unable to advance without getting caught in the barrage of arrows from the English longbowmen. To make matters worse for the French, the terrain was not conducive to infantry movements. The narrow battlefield, with its muddy ground and obstacles, severely limited the maneuverability of the French infantry. The English longbowmen were positioned strategically behind defensive stakes, creating a wall of protection that the French infantry could not breach. This forced the French to push forward in tight, disorganized formations, which made them easy targets for the English archers. The French infantry's attempt to engage the English directly was met with disastrous results. As they advanced, they were cut down by arrows from the longbowmen. The French were unable to use their traditional formations, and they were picked off one by one as they attempted to charge. The English archers, who had been trained for this type of warfare, were able to strike with precision, taking down the French soldiers with each volley. The lack of coordination and leadership within the French army became evident. The French infantry lacked the discipline and training to respond effectively to the English tactics. As the battle raged on, the French began to retreat, but the narrow battlefield made it difficult for them to escape. Many French soldiers became trapped in the mud, and the chaos escalated. In this moment, the English were able to seize the initiative completely. The French forces, once confident in their overwhelming numbers, were now in disarray. The French infantry, which had been expected to deliver a decisive blow, were now fighting for their lives as they were slowly pushed back by the disciplined English forces. The French army, which had been organized and well supplied, had become a disorganized mob in the face of the English longbowmen's devastating effect. As the battle continued to unfold, the French were faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation. The overwhelming numerical superiority they had initially enjoyed had been systematically nullified by the effectiveness of the English longbowmen, the difficult terrain, and the disorganization that plagued the French leadership. The narrow battlefield, combined with the rain-soaked, muddy conditions, played to the advantage of the English. The French cavalry, unable to charge or maneuver effectively, were caught in a deadly trap. The infantry, many of whom had already been decimated by the relentless volleys of arrows, began to falter. By the time the French attempted to reorganize their forces, they were surrounded. The flanks, previously guarded by the French cavalry, were now wide open. The English archers, who had been relentlessly firing at the French forces throughout the engagement, were able to shift positions and close in on the French from multiple angles. With their defensive positions crumbling, the French infantry found themselves trapped in a deadly pincers movement. At this point, the English forces launched a final, decisive push. The longbowmen, having inflicted severe damage on the French knights and infantry, began to advance on the French lines, pushing forward with their own men-at-arms and reinforcing the defense. The French, who were already exhausted and disheartened by the continuous assault, were unable to hold their ground any longer. The disorganized retreat, made difficult by the mud and the narrow space, became a rout. This moment marked the turning point of the battle. The French, once confident in their victory, were now in full retreat. Their army had been broken, their cavalry neutralized, and their infantry scattered. The English forces, though outnumbered, had fought with remarkable discipline, and their tactics had crushed the French hope for a swift and decisive victory. As the battle turned in favor of the English, the French leadership suffered a severe breakdown. The once proud French command structure, which had boasted a number of experienced commanders and knights, now collapsed under the pressure of the battlefield. Constable Charles d'Albret, the leader of the French forces, was unable to coordinate an effective response to the unfolding disaster. His failure to adapt to the changing circumstances and his inability to unite the French forces sealed the fate of the army. French leadership had been plagued by internal divisions throughout the 100 Years' War, and this disunity became painfully evident during the battle. The French court had been weakened by years of infighting between factions like the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. This fragmentation not only weakened their political stability, but also had a direct impact on their military cohesion. The lack of unified command meant that the French army was disorganized, with commanders unable to coordinate their efforts and respond to the English threat effectively. The French knights, despite their initial confidence, were no longer able to rely on their traditional methods of warfare. The cavalry, which had been the backbone of French military tactics for centuries, was ineffective in the face of the English longbowmen and the battlefield conditions. As the French forces began to lose ground, it became clear that their traditional reliance on mounted knights would no longer guarantee them victory. King Charles VI, who had been suffering from mental illness, was not able to provide the leadership the French army desperately needed. The failure of the French high command to provide direction and adapt to the realities of the battlefield left their soldiers vulnerable. With the retreat of the French forces, the English had gained the upper hand. The French leadership's inability to handle the crisis led to a complete collapse of their military power on the field. With the French forces in disarray, the English army made its final push to secure victory. Henry V, observing the breakdown of the French lines, seized the opportunity to act decisively. The English longbowmen, whose incessant rain of arrows had already inflicted tremendous casualties on the French knights, now began to move forward, pushing into the French ranks and finishing the job that their arrows had started. As the French forces continued to retreat, the English infantry began to press harder, aided by their longbowmen and a small contingent of men-at-arms. The French, exhausted and demoralized, were no match for the relentless pursuit of the English forces. The narrowness of the battlefield made it difficult for the French to escape, and many were captured or killed in the melee. Despite their numerical superiority at the outset, the French forces were now being overwhelmed by the superior tactics and discipline of the English. As the day wore on, the English forces, although greatly outnumbered, were able to capitalize on their advantages. The once proud French army, reduced in numbers and morale, began to crumble completely. The French command, in shambles, could no longer rally its troops to mount any effective defense. By the late afternoon, it was clear that the battle was won. The French forces had been decisively defeated, and their remnants were now either fleeing or being slaughtered. The English had triumphed against all odds. The Battle of Agincourt had turned into one of the most stunning military victories in history, a testament to the power of effective leadership, tactical innovation, and the might of the English longbow. The aftermath of the Battle of Agincourt was marked by heavy casualties on the French side, with thousands of soldiers killed or taken prisoner. The French losses were catastrophic. Estimates of French casualties vary, but it is generally agreed that around 6,000 to 10,000 French soldiers were either killed or captured, including many prominent knights and commanders. In contrast, English casualties were much lighter, with around 400 to 1,000 men lost, a remarkable feat considering the disparity in numbers between the two armies. The French leadership had suffered a severe blow. Several high-ranking members of the French nobility were taken prisoner, including the Duke of Orleans, one of the most influential figures in the French court. The capture of these nobles was a significant blow to the morale of the French and further weakened their ability to resist the English. The victory at Agincourt also had profound political implications. Henry V's reputation as a military leader was solidified, and his victory greatly strengthened his claim to the French throne. In the wake of the battle, he would go on to secure more territory in France, furthering his ambitions to become the ruler of France. The battle also marked a turning point in the 100 Years' War, with the English emerging as a dominant force in the conflict, while the French were left to deal with the repercussions of their defeat. The consequences of the battle were felt far beyond the battlefield. Agincourt would go down in history as one of the most significant victories of the 100 Years' War and as a turning point in medieval warfare. The English longbow, which had played such a pivotal role in the battle, would be remembered as a game-changing weapon, and Henry V's leadership would be admired for centuries to come. The Battle of Agincourt's outcome sent shockwaves through medieval Europe. In the aftermath of this stunning English victory, Henry V's reputation as a military leader was further solidified, and the French were left to grapple with the implications of their crushing defeat. The battle not only secured the survival of English forces in France, but also marked a major turning point in the 100 Years' War. Henry V's forces had proven that a smaller, well-disciplined army could overcome a larger, less organized force through the use of superior tactics and weaponry. The English longbowmen, who had been the backbone of the English army, were now viewed as one of the most formidable forces in medieval warfare. Their devastating effect on the French knights demonstrated the power of infantry in an era traditionally dominated by cavalry. The longbowmen's ability to fire arrows at a rapid rate, combined with their position on the battlefield, allowed them to decimate the French cavalry, whose once feared charge became useless in the face of relentless fire. The French, meanwhile, were left to pick up the pieces after their catastrophic defeat. In the aftermath of Agincourt, they had lost not only thousands of soldiers, but also many of their nobility. The captured French nobles, including the Duke of Orleans and other prominent figures, would remain in English captivity for several years. These captured leaders were not only symbolic of the French defeat, but also served as a bargaining chip for the English in future negotiations. King Henry V's victory at Agincourt propelled him to greater prominence on the world stage. His ability to rally his troops and maintain discipline under immense pressure during the battle would become the cornerstone of his legacy. In the following years, he would press his claim to the French throne even more aggressively, and his victory at Agincourt became a key symbol of English strength. This triumph would lay the groundwork for a series of successful campaigns in France, although the ultimate outcome of the 100 Years' War will be determined by factors far beyond Agincourt. The battle's legacy would echo through history, inspiring military leaders and becoming an enduring symbol of underdog triumph. For centuries, Agincourt was held up as the quintessential example of how discipline, innovation, and leadership could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The success of Henry V at Agincourt was not just a reflection of his army's military prowess. It was also a testament to his leadership. Henry's ability to inspire his men, his sharp tactical mind, and his unwavering determination were key to the victory. At a time when kings were expected to lead from the front, Henry's actions on the battlefield were a clear demonstration of his commitment to his army and his country. Henry V's leadership style was far more hands-on than that of many medieval monarchs. He was personally involved in the day-to-day operations of his army, ensuring that his soldiers were well-equipped, well-fed, and well-trained. His speech before the battle, as recorded by Shakespeare, is one of the most famous examples of a king rallying his troops. By emphasizing the honor and glory of the fight ahead, Henry created a sense of unity and purpose within his army, even though they were exhausted, sick, and outnumbered. His leadership was also marked by his ability to make bold decisions, which would become a hallmark of his reign. When the opportunity to fight the French presented itself, despite the odds, Henry seized it without hesitation. He understood that the battle was not just about military victory, but about solidifying his authority and securing his claim to the French throne. His confidence in his men and his unwavering belief in the righteousness of his cause helped cement his place in English history as one of the nation's most respected monarchs. Henry's decisive action at Agincourt ensured that his name would live on as a symbol of medieval kingship. The victory not only bolstered his own authority, but also greatly enhanced England's prestige in the eyes of other European powers. In many ways, his success at Agincourt marked the beginning of a more aggressive phase of the 100 Years' War, one where England would hold the upper hand in the conflict for the next several decades. The French response to their defeat at Agincourt was one of shock, disarray, and a determination to recover their strength. The battle had been a blow to French morale, and the heavy losses in both men and leadership would take years to mend. Following the defeat, the French were forced to confront not only their military failures, but also the internal divisions that had plagued their society for decades. The French nobility, reeling from the loss of so many of their prominent figures, found themselves divided over how to respond to the English threat. At the time of Agincourt, France was politically fragmented. The country was embroiled in a bitter civil war between two factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. These two groups vied for control of the French court and the throne, weakening the kingdom's ability to mount a unified response to the English invasion. The French nobility was torn, with some factions unwilling to cooperate with others, even in the face of the English threat. This disunity contributed significantly to the failure of the French military to effectively challenge Henry V's forces. Despite these setbacks, the French did not give up the fight. After Agincourt, the French rallied under the leadership of new commanders, and they began to rebuild their forces. They adopted new tactics and sought to reestablish a sense of unity within the country. Over the next few years, the French managed to repel some of the English advances, although the damage done to their national pride and military strength could not be easily repaired. The recovery from Agincourt was not immediate, and the French had to endure several more years of setbacks. However, the memory of their defeat would serve as a catalyst for the eventual French resurgence. The later years of the 100 Years' War would see the emergence of powerful French leaders, such as Joan of Arc, who would help unite the country and push back against the English forces. The loss at Agincourt was a painful chapter in French history, but it ultimately set the stage for their eventual victory in the war. After the resounding victory at Agincourt, King Henry V knew that his next steps were crucial to solidifying England's position in France. The battle had broken the back of the French army, and many of their leading nobles were either dead or taken prisoner, but the war was far from over. Despite the victory, Henry's forces were still deep within enemy territory, and much work was needed to maintain control of the land they had won. The English king understood that Agincourt had provided a strategic opening, but the political and military challenges of holding on to France were monumental. Immediately after the battle, Henry V moved quickly to capitalize on the French disarray. He began by securing the vital town of Calais, a key English stronghold in northern France, as a base of operations. From there, he began to assert more control over the surrounding regions, focusing on areas of strategic importance. With many of France's noble families in disarray, Henry was able to apply pressure on several key towns, including Rouen, a vital city in Normandy. While securing territory, Henry also used diplomacy to his advantage. He sought to make alliances with various French factions that had been engaged in infighting for years. The rivalries between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians were seen as opportunities for Henry to insert English influence into the political landscape. He began to shift the balance of power within France, often playing one faction off against the other. However, despite his ability to maneuver politically, Henry faced resistance from French forces loyal to their king, Charles VI, who began to regroup in the wake of the Agincourt disaster. Henry's military campaign was methodical. Even as he pursued his ambitions, he faced constant challenges from the weather, disease, and the logistical nightmare of maintaining an army in a foreign land. The long march from Agincourt to the English-held territories of northern France was arduous, and many of the soldiers who survived the battle began to succumb to disease, primarily dysentery. Despite these hardships, Henry V pressed on, demonstrating that his victory at Agincourt was not merely a stroke of luck, but the result of an unwavering commitment to his campaign in France. The English began to consolidate their positions in northern France, setting the stage for more military engagements. However, they had yet to secure the overall peace or the ultimate victory in the war. The English leadership's ability to hold on to their gains in France would be tested in the years that followed, especially as the French would slowly begin to recover their strength and prepare for a resurgence. The immediate aftermath of Agincourt saw Henry V continuing his military successes, but the long-term consequences of the battle extended far beyond the territories that the English managed to secure. Agincourt was a turning point not only in the Hundred Years' War, but also in the evolution of warfare. The effectiveness of the English longbow and the tactical innovation used by Henry V had profound implications for future military engagements. The battle highlighted the growing importance of infantry over traditional cavalry, and the days of the mounted knight as the dominant force on the battlefield were numbered. As for the political ramifications, the English victory at Agincourt gave Henry V a stronger claim to the French throne. In the aftermath of his successes, he pursued the Treaty of Troyes, 1420, which declared Henry as the legitimate heir to the French throne, effectively making him the regent of France. The treaty also led to the disinheritance of Charles VII, the Dauphin, in favor of Henry V's claim. However, Henry's untimely death in 1422, just months after securing the treaty, left England's position in France precarious. The premature death of Henry V, at just 34 years old, would result in his infant son, Henry VI, ascending to the throne of England, weakening the English claim to France and leaving the kingdom vulnerable to internal struggles. The French, despite the devastation of Agincourt, began to recover in the following years. With the death of Henry V, the English cause in France began to falter. The French, led by Charles VII, mounted a determined resistance, aided by figures like Joan of Arc, who would later help lead French forces to several key victories. Over the next few decades, English control over France steadily diminished. The Hundred Years' War ultimately ended in 1453, nearly 4 decades after Agincourt. By then, England had lost nearly all its territorial holdings in France, with only Calais remaining under English control. While Agincourt marked a high point for the English, it was ultimately a fleeting moment in the larger context of the war. The final defeat of England and the restoration of French power were the consequences of shifting military dynamics, internal divisions within England, and the rise of effective French leadership. For England, Agincourt became a symbol of what could have been, a moment of extraordinary military triumph that was not followed through with the necessary political stability to maintain it. For France, Agincourt became a symbol of a nation brought to its knees, only to rise again with renewed vigor and resilience. Conclusion: Agincourt's place in history. The Battle of Agincourt remains one of the most famous and significant battles in the history of warfare. It is a testament to the importance of tactical ingenuity, leadership, and discipline, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The use of the longbow by the English, the strategic deployment of forces, and Henry V's personal leadership would influence military tactics for generations. The battle also symbolizes the unpredictable nature of war. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the English army, with its well-executed tactics and determination, achieved a stunning victory over the French. The consequences of the battle rippled through Europe for years, altering the course of the 100 Years' War and reshaping the political landscape of France and England. The legend of Agincourt has endured for centuries, immortalized in literature, such as William Shakespeare's famous play Henry V, and in the collective memory of both the English and the French. In many ways, the battle represents both the heights of military achievement and the fragility of empire. Though the English would ultimately lose their hold on France, the legacy of Agincourt, as a shining moment in English military history, continues to be celebrated as one of the greatest underdog victories in history. The psychological impact of the Battle of Agincourt on the French was profound and long-lasting. The loss was not just a military setback, but a deep psychological blow that shook the French national psyche. For centuries, France had been considered one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, its military dominance symbolized by the chivalric order and the might of its knights. To lose so decisively at the hands of a numerically inferior force was an unimaginable humiliation. French morale was severely affected by the sheer scale of the defeat. The loss of so many noble lives, including prominent knights and leaders, left a significant void in French military and political leadership. The capture of high-ranking French nobility, including the Duke of Orleans and other distinguished knights, served as a stark reminder of France's vulnerability. Many of these captives would spend years in English custody, further undermining French authority. The captured leaders were not only symbolic of France's defeat, but were also used by Henry V to assert his dominance and claim legitimacy as a ruler of France. The French military, which had long prided itself on its cavalry and the dominance of mounted knights, was forced to confront the fact that their traditional methods of fighting were no longer viable in the face of new tactics. The English longbowmen, armed with the ability to shoot arrows at high velocity and with deadly precision, had rendered the traditional cavalry charge ineffective. The French had underestimated the effectiveness of the longbow, and the result was devastating. As the French forces were broken, they realized that their vaunted knights were not invincible, and their entire approach to warfare had been called into question. The loss at Agincourt was not merely a defeat on the battlefield. It was a cultural shock. It challenged the very notion of French military superiority and left the French struggling to rebuild their confidence. The consequences were felt not just in the immediate aftermath, but for many years to come, as the French worked to regain the strength and unity needed to recover from this crushing blow. Over the centuries, the Battle of Agincourt has been immortalized in both English and French culture, often symbolizing themes of heroism, tragedy, and the unpredictable nature of war. One of the most enduring accounts of the battle comes from William Shakespeare's play Henry V, in which the battle is depicted as a shining moment in English history. Shakespeare's portrayal of King Henry's famous St. Crispin's Day speech, delivered to rally his troops before the battle, has become a central element of Agincourt's cultural legacy. Shakespeare's play romanticizes the battle, focusing on the nobility of Henry's cause and the valor of his soldiers, particularly the longbowmen. The speech, in which Henry urges his men that they few, we happy few, we band of brothers, will forever be remembered for their courage, has become one of the most famous lines in English literature. This image of the battle as a heroic victory for the outnumbered English forces helped shape the public perception of Agincourt for generations. The battle has also been the subject of numerous historical accounts, many of which emphasize the brilliance of Henry V's leadership and the tactical genius of the English army. These stories highlight the discipline, resolve, and strategy that allowed the English to overcome the overwhelming French forces. The historical narratives often underscore the significance of the longbow in English military success, cementing its place as one of the most innovative weapons of the period. On the French side, the battle has taken on a more tragic significance. Over the centuries, Agincourt has been a symbol of the vulnerability and fallibility of even the most powerful nations. For the French, the memory of the battle is often intertwined with the greater narrative of the 100 Years' War, where multiple defeats, including Agincourt, contributed to the eventual downfall of their forces. While the French would go on to recover and eventually win the war, Agincourt remains a scar on their collective memory, symbolizing the pride of a nation brought low by an unexpected and humiliating defeat. Agincourt's legacy is thus dual-faced. On the English side, it is a symbol of military triumph and a powerful rallying point for national identity, while on the French side, it serves as a reminder of the fragility of power and the long road to recovery after a catastrophic loss. The political consequences of Agincourt reverberated through Europe for many years. The battle not only marked a decisive military victory for Henry V, but it also had significant diplomatic implications, particularly regarding the relationship between England and France. Following the battle, Henry V was in an increasingly advantageous position to press his claim to the French throne. His next move was a diplomatic one, which would shape the future of both kingdoms. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, was the direct result of Henry V's victory at Agincourt. Under the terms of the treaty, Henry V was recognized as the heir to the French throne, and he was married to Catherine of Valois, the daughter of King Charles VI of France. The treaty disinherited Charles VII, the Dauphin, who had been the rightful heir to the throne of France, and placed Henry V in a position to eventually inherit the French crown upon the death of Charles VI. The Treaty of Troyes was a remarkable diplomatic achievement for Henry V. It not only solidified his claim to the French throne, but also effectively divided the French kingdom, with the Burgundians supporting Henry V's claim while the Armagnacs remained loyal to Charles VII. The division within France weakened the French resistance to English rule and created internal conflicts that would last for many years. However, Henry V's success was short-lived. His untimely death in 1422, just months after the signing of the Treaty of Troyes, threw England's gains in France into jeopardy. Henry V's infant son, Henry VI, succeeded him to the English throne, but the young king was far from equipped to navigate the complex political landscape of France. The Regency, which was controlled by a series of English and French advisors, was unable to maintain the tenuous English hold on French territory. As England's position in France weakened, French forces began to recover. The rise of Joan of Arc, who played a pivotal role in uniting France and leading successful military campaigns, marked the turning of the tide. The English, despite their success at Agincourt, began to lose ground in France, and by 1453, they had been driven out of nearly all French territory, with the exception of Calais. While the Treaty of Troyes initially appeared to secure English dominance in France, the events that followed the death of Henry V in 1422 marked the beginning of the slow unraveling of English power in France. Henry V's unexpected death, just months after the treaty signing, left the English with a fragile claim to the French throne. His infant son, Henry VI, succeeded him, but the young king was not yet capable of wielding the political or military power necessary to maintain the gains made by his father. The Regency, established to rule on behalf of the infant Henry VI, was divided between English and French factions, each vying for control of the young king's future and the direction of the war. The French, however, were beginning to regain their strength. The internal strife between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, which had been exacerbated by Henry V's victory in the Treaty of Troyes, continued to fracture France. The presence of powerful leaders such as Charles VII, the Dauphin, who had been disinherited under the terms of the treaty, became increasingly influential. The English, despite their victory at Agincourt and the political advantages that the treaty had offered them, faced mounting challenges in maintaining their control over French territory. The key cities and regions that had once fallen under English influence began to slip from their grasp. As the French began to rally under Charles VII, supported by key figures like Joan of Arc, their ability to resist English forces improved. English commanders struggled to match the determined leadership of the French, who had begun to turn the tide. The political instability in England, exacerbated by the prolonged conflict and Henry VI's youth, played a major role in the weakening of English power in France. The war had drained English resources, and the burden of maintaining a prolonged military presence in France, combined with increasing internal unrest, made it difficult for England to retain control. Over the next few decades, English forces found themselves on the defensive, and their previously strong position in France steadily eroded. As the French gathered strength, English control over key French territories began to diminish. By 1453, the English had lost nearly all of their holdings in France, with the exception of the port city of Calais. The Battle of Agincourt, while a major military triumph, proved to be the high point of English involvement in the 100 Years' War, as it ultimately led to a series of military and political missteps that resulted in the eventual English withdrawal from France. One of the most significant factors in the eventual French recovery from the disastrous consequences of Agincourt was the rise of Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from Lorraine who would go on to play a pivotal role in reversing the fortunes of France. Joan's appearance in French history during the 1420s marked a dramatic shift in the course of the 100 Years' War. She inspired the French troops and the people of France, giving them a renewed sense of purpose and unity. Her influence would contribute significantly to the French victory, turning the tide of the war and signaling the decline of English power in France. Joan of Arc's story began when, at the age of 13, she claimed to have received visions from saints instructing her to support Charles VII and help drive the English out of France. Despite her humble background, Joan was able to gain the trust of Charles VII and his advisors, who were desperate for a breakthrough. At the time, France was struggling, and Charles VII's claim to the throne was weak. The English had control over much of France, and morale among the French had plummeted. Joan's arrival was a turning point in the war. Her conviction and her religious zeal inspired the French soldiers, and her presence on the battlefield rallied the troops. She played a crucial role in lifting the siege of Orleans in 1429, which was one of the most significant victories for the French in the war. The victory at Orleans boosted French morale and provided a significant propaganda victory for Charles VII, solidifying his position as the rightful king of France. Joan's rise to prominence galvanized the French people, who had been demoralized by years of English occupation and internal divisions. Her influence was not limited to military victories. Joan's ability to unite the French forces under the banner of Charles VII helped solidify his authority and laid the groundwork for the eventual reconquest of France. She became a symbol of French resistance and national pride, embodying the spirit of a unified France determined to reclaim its sovereignty. Despite her eventual capture and execution by the English in 1431, Joan's legacy would live on. Her martyrdom further fueled French resolve, and her memory would continue to inspire future generations. The French, now united under the banner of Charles VII, began a series of military successes that would eventually lead to the expulsion of the English from all but Calais. Joan of Arc's role in the war marked a decisive shift in French fortunes, contributing to the final collapse of English power in France. The final stages of the 100 Years' War saw the gradual but inevitable decline of English power in France. After the rise of Joan of Arc and the eventual restoration of French morale, the French began to reclaim the territories lost to the English over the previous decades. The victories at Orleans, followed by the coronation of Charles VII as King of France in Reims in 1429, marked a significant turning point in the war. By the early 1450s, French forces, bolstered by a combination of military strategy, leadership, and the revitalization of national pride, began to push the English out of key regions. The English, despite their initial successes at Agincourt and their strong position in the early stages of the war, were ultimately unable to maintain control over France. The defeat at Agincourt, while a decisive victory at the time, became a symbol of the fleeting nature of English success in France. In the years following Henry V's death, English fortunes began to unravel. The loss of key leaders, internal political struggles, and the growing effectiveness of French military commanders all contributed to the eventual English withdrawal. By 1453, the English had lost virtually all of their French territories, save for Calais, which remained under English control until 1558. The Treaty of Picquigny in 1475 marked the official end of hostilities between England and France, signaling the conclusion of the Hundred Years' War. The war had begun with territorial disputes, and after nearly a century of fighting, it ended with England effectively defeated in its claim to French lands. The Battle of Agincourt, though one of the most celebrated victories in English military history, ultimately represented a moment of triumph in an ongoing conflict that would later be overshadowed by the larger political and military shifts. While the battle's immediate effects were profound, its long-term impact on the English throne would be overshadowed by the broader dynamics of the war and the eventual resurgence of French power. The English loss of France, coupled with the internal political instability of the War of the Roses, meant that the legacy of Agincourt was bittersweet, as England's position in France proved to be unsustainable in the long run. The Battle of Agincourt had a profound impact on English society, shaping its cultural and political landscape for generations. As one of the most significant victories in English military history, Agincourt became a symbol of national pride and unity. For the English people, the victory was seen as a triumph of discipline, leadership, and tactical innovation, particularly the role of the English longbowmen. The battle became central to English identity, particularly in the 15th century, and was celebrated in literature, art, and oral traditions for centuries to come. The victory at Agincourt reinforced the legitimacy of the English monarchy. Henry V, who had already established a strong reputation as a warrior king, became a national hero. His victory on the battlefield demonstrated his leadership qualities and cemented his legacy in English history. Agincourt helped solidify his authority and fostered a sense of unity among the English people, particularly as they faced external threats and internal challenges in the years following the battle. Henry V's ability to inspire his men, coupled with his military acumen, ensured that his victory would be remembered for centuries. The battle also reinforced the growing importance of the English longbow as a military weapon. The longbow, once a tool of English commoners, had proven itself as a decisive factor in battle. The longbowman's ability to unleash a hail of arrows with deadly precision decimated the French cavalry, a traditionally dominant force in medieval warfare. In the wake of Agincourt, the longbow became a symbol of the power of the common soldier, marking a shift in military tactics that would continue to evolve in the centuries to come. In addition to the military and political consequences, Agincourt was also immortalized in the arts. The most famous example of this is William Shakespeare's play Henry V, written in the early 16th century. Shakespeare's portrayal of the battle and Henry's speech before it became iconic representations of English nationalism and the virtues of leadership and valor. The famous lines from Henry's St. Crispin's Day speech, which rally his troops with promises of honor and glory, have become one of the most recognized excerpts in English literature, reflecting the battle's lasting cultural significance. While the Battle of Agincourt was a significant and proud moment in English history, for the French, it marked a national trauma that deeply impacted their collective memory and national identity. The scale of the defeat, coupled with the loss of so many prominent nobles, left an indelible scar on France's psyche. The battle not only shattered French morale, but also symbolized the fragile state of the French monarchy and the divided nature of French politics at the time. In the immediate aftermath of Agincourt, the French were left grappling with the implications of their defeat. The loss of many leading nobles, along with the capture of high-ranking prisoners, such as the Duke of Orleans, dealt a blow to the French nobility. These losses further weakened the French monarchy, which was already struggling with internal divisions, notably the conflict between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. This political disunity contributed to the failure of the French response in the years following Agincourt, as the French lacked the cohesion necessary to mount an effective counteroffensive against the English. Despite the devastation of Agincourt, the defeat ultimately played a crucial role in the unification of France. The battle served as a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the need for unity in the face of external threats. Over the following years, the French rallied under the leadership of Charles VII, the Dauphin, who had been disinherited under the Treaty of Troyes. The rise of Joan of Arc in the 1420s became a key turning point in the French recovery. Joan's leadership and religious zeal helped inspire the French people to fight back against the English, marking the beginning of a resurgence that would eventually lead to French victory in the war. The memory of Agincourt, while painful, played a significant role in the process of French recovery. It reinforced the importance of national unity, which was crucial to overcoming the internal divisions that had weakened France. In many ways, the defeat at Agincourt acted as a catalyst for the eventual French victory, spurring the French to reassert their sovereignty and reclaim their lands for the English. The battle became a symbol of the fragility of French power, but also of the resilience and determination that would define France's eventual resurgence in the war. While the French began their recovery following Agincourt, England was facing its own set of challenges. The victory at Agincourt, though significant in military terms, did not translate into long-term success in France. The political instability in England, particularly the internal strife that would culminate in the War of the Roses, severely undermined the English position in France and contributed to their eventual withdrawal. The death of Henry V in 1422, so soon after the Treaty of Troyes, created a leadership vacuum. His infant son, Henry VI, ascended to the throne, but England's political and military direction was left in the hands of regents. The regency struggled to maintain control of both England and its territories in France. The internal division between the Lancastrians and Yorkists, who each claimed the English throne, further destabilized England and led to years of civil conflict. This distraction at home made it difficult for the English to focus on their campaign in France, allowing the French to regain momentum. The War of the Roses, which began in the 1450s, was a series of dynastic conflicts between the two factions of the English royal family. The fighting, which was fueled by competing claims to the throne, diverted English resources away from France and crippled the ability of the English monarchy to maintain its hold on the French territories. As the Yorkists and Lancastrians fought for supremacy in England, the French took advantage of this internal division and began systematically reclaiming their territory. By 1453, the English had lost nearly all of their holdings in France, except for Calais. The French, under Charles VII, had successfully driven the English out of nearly all the land they had once controlled. The fall of Bordeaux and the final French victory at Castillon marked the end of English ambitions in France. The Treaty of Picquigny in 1475 effectively ended English involvement in the Hundred Years' War, marking the conclusion of a conflict that had begun in 1337. The English defeat in France, exacerbated by internal conflict, shifted the focus of English politics and power back to the island. The loss of France would have lasting consequences for English foreign policy and its relationship with France, setting the stage for future conflicts, including the Wars of the Roses and the eventual rise of the Tudor dynasty. In the wake of Henry V's death and the subsequent loss of English territories in France, England faced a series of internal conflicts that would erupt into the Wars of the Roses, a prolonged civil war between the Lancastrian and Yorkist factions. The Wars of the Roses, which lasted from 1455 to 1487, were fueled by competing claims to the English throne, but the defeat in France and the chaotic political landscape that followed Henry V's passing played a significant role in exacerbating these divisions. The root of the conflict can be traced back to the uncertain rule of Henry VI, whose reign was marred by periods of mental illness and political instability. Henry VI was a weak monarch, and his inability to manage the affairs of the state left a power vacuum that invited factions to vie for control. The most prominent contenders were the Lancastrians, who were loyal to Henry VI and his bloodline, and the Yorkists, led by Richard, Duke of York, who believed that his family had a stronger claim to the throne. The rivalry between these two factions would lead to decades of bloody conflict. The Wars of the Roses were characterized by a series of battles, betrayals, and shifting allegiances. The English nobility was divided into two hostile camps, each seeking to control the throne. This division within England undermined the country's ability to respond effectively to external threats, including its ongoing rivalry with France. In many ways, the Wars of the Roses represented the final fracturing of the English state after the unifying moment of Agincourt. The loss of French territories had already weakened England's international standing, and now, the internal division between the Lancastrians and Yorkists threatened the stability of the kingdom itself. The conflict would not end until 1487, after the Battle of Bosworth Field, when Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, defeated Richard III, the last Yorkist king, and established the Tudor dynasty. The Wars of the Roses had significant consequences for England, not just politically, but socially and economically. The nobility, having been decimated by decades of warfare, was never the same, and the monarchy's authority was severely compromised. However, from this period of civil strife arose a new, more centralized form of government under the Tudor monarchy, which would lay the foundations for the English Renaissance and the eventual rise of England as a global power. The English monarchy's transition from the unstable reign of Henry VI to the solidification of the Tudor dynasty under Henry VII is one of the most significant outcomes of the Wars of the Roses. The Battle of Agincourt, which had initially bolstered the English monarchy and their ambitions in France, was ultimately a fleeting victory in the face of the domestic instability that followed. The turbulent years between 1422 and 1485 were marked by the deepening of internal divisions that prevented the English from capitalizing on their earlier successes. The death of Henry V in 1422 left his infant son, Henry VI, to inherit the throne, but the English monarchy was ill-equipped to handle the challenges of governing a divided kingdom and the vast, distant territories in France. The English defeat in France and the subsequent civil strife rendered the English monarchy incapable of maintaining its grip on foreign lands. However, the English throne would eventually be consolidated under Henry VII, who founded the Tudor dynasty in 1485 after his victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field. This victory effectively ended the Wars of the Roses and marked the beginning of a new era in English history. Henry VII's rise to power was not just the result of his military victory. It was also a consequence of the political shifts that took place after the exhaustion of the previous conflicts. He capitalized on the widespread disillusionment with the existing nobility who had been ravaged by years of civil war. Henry VII worked to strengthen the monarchy by consolidating power, ensuring that no faction could challenge his reign. He did this through a combination of strategic marriages, such as his union with Elizabeth of York, and by instituting policies that curtailed the influence of the nobility. This brought relative peace to England after decades of chaos and positioned the country for future growth and prosperity. The establishment of the Tudor dynasty marked a shift away from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses toward a more centralized, stable rule. Under Henry VII and his successors, England would undergo significant political, religious, and cultural transformations. The impact of Agincourt on the Tudor dynasty was indirect but important. The lessons learned from the military and political failures that followed the victory at Agincourt would shape Henry VII's approach to governance. By securing his position on the throne and stabilizing the kingdom, Henry VII was able to lay the groundwork for the rise of the English Renaissance, which would see a flourishing of art, exploration, and economic growth in the years to come. The Battle of Agincourt is remembered not only for its dramatic victory, but also for the significant impact it had on military tactics and weaponry during the late medieval period. The English longbow, in particular, became one of the most iconic elements of the battle and had a lasting influence on military strategy. The ability of the longbowmen to decimate the heavily armored French cavalry and infantry marked a turning point in how battles were fought and signaled the decline of the medieval knight's dominance on the battlefield. Before Agincourt, European warfare was dominated by heavily armored cavalry, particularly knights who were considered the epitome of military strength. The cavalry charge had been the primary method of engaging the enemy for centuries. However, the longbowmen at Agincourt demonstrated that well-disciplined infantry armed with powerful bows could neutralize this traditional military strength. The longbowmen's ability to shoot arrows at a rapid rate, with remarkable accuracy and from a distance, made them invaluable in battles such as Agincourt. The longbow's effectiveness in piercing through the armor of the French knights fundamentally changed the way military leaders thought about tactics. Agincourt also marked the increasing importance of ranged infantry in battles, as opposed to traditional reliance on cavalry. The shift toward using long-range weapons, such as the longbow, crossbow, and eventually gunpowder firearms, would continue to influence military tactics for centuries. The success of the English longbowmen demonstrated that battles could be won by infantry without the need for a dominant cavalry force. This insight would lead to the gradual decline of the medieval knight as the central figure in European warfare. As the use of the longbow grew, other European nations began to adopt similar tactics. While the French, after Agincourt, would continue to rely on their knights for some time, they would eventually adapt to the changing nature of warfare. By the time of the Renaissance, the dominance of cavalry was waning, and new weapons, including firearms, began to replace the longbow in military engagements. The Battle of Agincourt and the events that followed also played a role in the gradual decline of feudalism in both England and France. Feudalism, the medieval social system that structured both military and economic relations, was already under strain by the early 15th century. However, the changes that occurred during and after the 100 Years' War, marked by the English victory at Agincourt, accelerated the transformation of this social order. Feudalism relied heavily on the military service of knights and their vassals, who were expected to fight for their lords in exchange for land and protection. However, Agincourt showcased a new form of warfare, one in which the common soldier, particularly the longbowman, played a central role. The battle made it clear that a well-organized infantry force, consisting of commoners armed with longbows, could defeat the heavily armored knights that had long been seen as the backbone of medieval armies. This shift began to erode the traditional power structure of feudal societies, where the aristocracy and nobility held the key military power. In England, the success of the longbowmen at Agincourt and the subsequent recognition of their value led to a change in the military structure. Over time, the need for large armies of heavily armored knights diminished, and more emphasis was placed on the use of infantry. This allowed for a more flexible, mobile, and economically efficient military. Feudal levies, which had once been a common source of troops, became less essential as standing armies became more prominent. The growing importance of professional soldiers, who were paid for their service, also marked the beginning of the decline of feudal obligations in favor of a more centralized, state-run military. In France, the impact of Agincourt also played a role in diminishing the feudal system's influence. The battle highlighted the limitations of the traditional feudal nobility in warfare. The heavy losses among the French knights at Agincourt not only weakened their military power, but also contributed to the broader societal realization that feudal obligations were no longer as relevant in the face of modern warfare. In the years that followed, both England and France began to experience changes in their social and political structures, with a gradual decline of feudalism giving way to more centralized monarchies. The weakening of the nobility's military power allowed for the rise of a more professional military class, signaling the end of the old feudal order. Feudalism's decline in the wake of Agincourt was part of a broader trend in Europe. By the 16th century, many European nations began to shift toward more centralized and bureaucratic systems of government. The rise of standing armies, funded by taxes and maintained by the state, marked the beginning of a new era in European military and political history. These changes would pave the way for the early modern state, where monarchs would gain greater control over both their military forces and the political structure of their kingdoms. The Battle of Agincourt holds a unique place in English culture, particularly as a symbol of national pride and identity. While the battle itself occurred in the midst of the 100 Years' War, it became a rallying point for the English people, representing not only military success, but also a moment of unity and purpose. Agincourt was particularly important because it marked the triumph of the English over a much larger and seemingly more powerful French force, underlining the theme of the underdog prevailing through discipline, strategy, and leadership. After the battle, Agincourt became a focal point for English nationalism, particularly in the works of poets, playwrights, and historians. The victory was framed as a heroic and almost mythical event, with English chroniclers emphasizing the courage and valor of the soldiers and their king, Henry V. The victory was seen as a testament to the power of the English monarchy and the strength of the English people. Over the centuries, Agincourt became a symbol of the nobility and virtue of England's military, elevating the role of the common soldier, particularly the longbowmen, who were often drawn from the peasantry and lower classes. Shakespeare's portrayal of Henry V, especially in his famous St. Crispin's Day speech, contributed greatly to the cultural significance of Agincourt. In Henry V, Shakespeare immortalized the battle as a heroic moment in English history, elevating it to the status of national myth. The speech, in which Henry calls on his soldiers to "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers," became one of the most enduring symbols of English martial pride. Through this portrayal, Shakespeare transformed Agincourt into a symbol of national unity and collective effort, resonating deeply with English audiences for generations. As time passed, Agincourt continued to be celebrated in English popular culture, from the monarchy to the common people. The battle became a point of reference in political discourse and national identity, particularly in times of conflict. The association of Agincourt with English resilience and unity remained potent throughout history, particularly during periods of military engagement or national struggle. For centuries, Agincourt was remembered as one of the defining moments in English history, a touchstone for national pride and military achievement. The battle's cultural significance was not limited to military success. It also became a symbol of the English spirit. The idea of victory against overwhelming odds became deeply embedded in English identity. This symbolism persisted in English history, being invoked during later conflicts, including the English Civil War and even the World Wars, where it was used to inspire the English people to stand firm in the face of adversity. The legacy of King Henry V, particularly as it relates to Agincourt, has been a subject of immense historical and cultural interest. Henry V is remembered not only for his military achievements, but also for his exemplary leadership and vision. His reign, though short, marked a pivotal period in English history, and Agincourt stands as the crowning achievement of his military career. Henry V's success at Agincourt, achieved despite significant challenges, reflected his remarkable skills as a leader. He demonstrated not only military acumen, but also the ability to inspire and lead men from all walks of life. Henry's leadership at Agincourt, where he personally led his troops and delivered stirring speeches to rally them, demonstrated his charisma and dedication to his cause. The king's ability to connect with his soldiers and motivate them to fight against overwhelming odds became a defining characteristic of his reign. His leadership at Agincourt set a standard for future monarchs and military commanders. And there you have it, the unforgettable story of the Battle of Agincourt. From the tactical brilliance of Henry V and the fall of French chivalry to the rise of professional armies, this battle was a turning point that reshaped the military and political landscape of Europe. But the true moral of the story lies in the power of unity, resilience, and leadership in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Agincourt reminds us that even when all seems lost, great leadership can turn the tide of history. What can we learn from this? Agincourt teaches us that in times of adversity, courage and strategy can lead to unimaginable victories, and that the rise and fall of empires often hinges on decisive moments. It's a timeless reminder that, in history, every setback can be the foundation for a greater comeback. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. We hope you found it as fascinating as we did. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to this history channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped the world. Join us again next time as we uncover more fascinating stories from the past. Stories that continue to inspire, challenge, and teach us today. Until then, keep seeking knowledge and never stop exploring history.